Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the second discussion on the Ethanol Speaker Series, a series of 6 virtual discussions with industry leaders on the role of ethanol in energy transition. My name is Alejandra Castillo. I'm the Regional Director for the U.S. Grains Council based in Singapore, and I am really happy tonight to welcome you all who are listening in and to welcome our 2 speakers to talk about the vehicle compatibility study. When we talk about ethanol, this particular topic has always come as one of the most important topics. You know, how can the automobile industry ensure that vehicles and cars that are being manufactured can work with different blends of ethanol? And to speak to us tonight, we have a leader of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, speaking to us about their latest research study on compatibility issues. But before we get started tonight, and I introduce our first speaker, let me just ensure that you see this housekeeping item slide. Make sure that you are familiarized with the layout of the platform. If you have any questions, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. However, you can start recording your questions or submitting your questions in your Q&A box that is right now shaking on the screen. And we will read them off as time allows towards the end of the presentation. But without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today, who will be giving us some background and is a great partner of the U.S. Grains Council in India, Mr. Prashant K. Banerjee, who is the Executive Director of the Society of Indian Automobile Association. Thank you, sir, for joining us tonight. Mr. Prashant is an alumnus of the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai. Mr. Banerjee has been more than 30 years of automobile industry experience. He has extensively worked in different capacities of engineering development, localization, advanced technologies, certification testing, regulations, and standard formulation roles in multinational companies. As the executive director of SIAM, he represents the auto industry in various policy, regulations, and standard committees of national and international levels. And it has been our pleasure at the Grains Council to develop our relationship and this friendship between SIAM and U.S. Grains Council. Mr. Banerjee, please take it away.
Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as applicable to all the delegates present here. Thank you, Alendra, for your kind introduction. On behalf of Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, SIAM, and its member company, I am extremely delighted, honored, and privileged to be part of this Ethanol Speaker Series 2 discussion on global ethanol blended fuel vehicle compatibility. Thank you for inviting SIAM to this Ethanol Speaker Series. I have the pleasure that I am sharing today's platform with Dr. Bob McCormick, Research Fellow, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and speaking on the subject, Global Ethanol Blended Fuel Vehicle Compatibility Study, being conducted by them. SIAM has been actively involved in the technical knowledge sharing for quite some time with US Grain Council, and US Grain Council has been a very close partner on India's ethanol blending journey. And we have attended many events like the Global Ethanol Summit at Washington. US Grain Council participated in India Auto Expo in 2020 beginning. And also the speakers from US Grain Councils presented the views and shared their experience of higher blends of ethanol in Future Mobility Summit during Auto Expo. Since 2018, many exciting developments have happened in ethanol front when higher blends of ethanol being used in transportation sector, and SIAM is grateful to be part of this accelerated ethanol journey growth and looks forward to support from partners like US Grain Council to achieve this Government of India goal. In 2009, I'm aware that NREL conducted a study to understand the effects of intermediate ethanol blends on legacy vehicles and small non-road engines, which was directed to the ethanol market. The earlier report, sponsored by US Department of Energy, Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE biomass program, and the EERE vehicle technology programs. Those informations were quite useful for us, and the purpose of the test program was to assess that how the vehicle viability with the intermediate blends as a contributor to the meeting national goals we used as a renewable fuel. Through a wide range of experiments, DOE evaluated the effects of E15 and E20 gasoline blends with 15% and 20% ethanol on tailpipe, evaporative emissions, catalyst, engine durability, vehicle drivability, engine operability, and vehicle and engine material, a study which is currently being done between IOCL, Indian Oil Corporation R&D Center, ARAI, and SIAM member companies, because we have a large number of vehicles at park which will be using higher blends of gasoline. So information shared by NREL has always been very useful, and all the member companies attending today this seminar are excited to learn what Bob will be presenting today with regards to the fuel economy, emissions, catalyst, temperatures, operability, and drivability. I'm sure his insights will be very useful to draw parallels to our challenge and ways to overcome the same. Similarly, I would also urge that the US Grain Council experience. I know that US has excellent experience in terms of providing different types of ethanol blends at the market. We would be excited to learn how we can, capitalize on US experience to make our life better and reach the higher blends goal easily without much challenge. So I'm sure that today's deliberations will be very useful for all the participants. Without further ado, I would like to thank once again US Grain Council for giving us this opportunity and hand over the session back to Alejandra, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. And thank you for setting it up so well. This topic is so important, especially for the people on the call today who are members of SIAM as well. But we are very curious to understand and to ensure that, as you said, the U.S. experience in this particular topic and in the U.S. ethanol industry is shared, and that information is made available as you and your counterparts in India are moving forward on the transition of the fleet, but also in helping India to move towards the goals set out under the ethanol roadmap that was recently shared by Government of India, which is a fantastic incentive and something that we are very supportive of, and we want to continue to partner with organizations like yours as you move forward in this process. Next, I want to introduce Robert McCormick, who is a Senior Research Fellow and Platform Leader for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, for Advanced Fuels and Combustion Research. His work focuses on end-use issues and fuel engine interactions with alternative fuels, primarily biofuels, including ethanol and biodiesel, as well as next-generation and futuristic fuels. End-use issues include supplying technical data to fuel engine compatibility and durability issues, field performance issues such as storage stability and cold weather performance, ignition and combustion kinetics, fuel effects on engine efficiency, and the impact of new fuels on emissions and the performance of emission control systems. Thank you very much, Robert, for joining us today, and we're really excited to hear about the latest research that you and your team conducted. And please take it away.
Well, thank you, Alejandra, for that kind introduction, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Banerjee for setting this up so well. yes, today I'd like to talk about some work we've done at the United States Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, entitled Global Ethanol Blended Fuel Vehicle Compatibility Study. So this main study question that we've tried to answer are vehicles in a set of target countries compatible with ethanol blended fuel. I list the target countries here, and of course India is very prominent among them. To talk about compatibility, we need to define it. Like anyone else, I looked it up in the dictionary. I liked the second definition here the best for this purpose: the ability to function or be integrated with other parts of any system. And so for a fuel, that means that the car or two or three wheeler should start easily and drive normally. There should be no catastrophic fuel system leaks, no corrosion or degradation of the engine or fuel system components, including emission components. And predominantly this comes down to materials compatibility. Is the fuel going to cause a problem with the materials of the engine or fuel system? And to adequate control of the air to fuel ratio. If you don't adequately control the air to fuel ratio, the emission control system won't function properly, and also the temperature of the exhaust might be significantly higher than the engine was designed. So with that definition, our approach to this study was first to try to understand what vehicles were being used in the target countries, and we used commercial databases, the Experian vehicles in operation database for automobiles, and a motorcycles.com database for motorcycles and three-wheelers. And then also we used a commercial database of fuel survey results to understand what fuels were currently being used. Critically, we examined the experience of ethanol introduction in the US and Brazil to try to understand if there were some specific engine or vehicle fuel systems that had issues with ethanol. And really, ultimately, to answer the question, are there vehicles in use that are not designed to use ethanol? And then finally, we looked at emission control technology level as a kind of a surrogate for ethanol compatibility. Are there, does emission control technology kind of imply compatibility with ethanol? And so with that, I'll launch into the US experience. The table shows some milestones that occurred in the US history of ethanol use, which began during the oil crisis time of the 1970s, where a tax incentive set off the production of fuel ethanol. And we see that in the 1978 to 1982 timeframe, the United States Environmental Protection Agency approved ethanol for use in all vehicles a couple of different times. And the EPA was presented with data that showed that there was no impact of 10% ethanol blends on elastomers in the field or other materials, that starting and drivability were normal, and there was no fuel system component degradation. And so at this time in the United States, there would have been cars in use that were manufactured even in the late 1960s, which would be pre-emission control cars. So we believe that this shows that the differences between conventional gasoline and 10% ethanol blends are so small that essentially all cars are compatible with 10% ethanol blends. And then much later, at the bottom of my table, in 2011, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency approved the use of 15% ethanol blends in 2001 and newer cars. This was based on an extensive study that Mr. Banerjee cited in his opening remarks. And then at the same time, industry funded an analysis that evaluated cars going back to 1994 which would be what in the United States we would refer to as Tier 1 emission cars, and showed that they were also very likely compatible with E15 blends. The Brazilian experience with ethanol goes back almost 100 years to the use of 75% ethanol, 25% ether blends in the 1920s. And even in the 1930s and during the Second World War, they used significant amounts of ethanol and gasoline. But in the post-war period, during an area of cheap oil, fuel ethanol production kind of went away in Brazil. But in the 1970s, during the oil crisis time, Brazil introduced 100% ethanol, 100% hydrous ethanol, and cars that were designed to run on it. And you can see this in the upper chart where we have conventional cars in the yellow, and in the late 1970s, the neat ethanol cars, which are the red line, began to dominate the market. But during this transition period in the late 1970s, ethanol introduced blends ranging from 10% to 22% ethanol and into their conventional cars, and saw, as we saw in the United States for 10% ethanol blends, no significant issues with the performance of the vehicles. So the conclusions from this historical analysis are that given no evidence of compatibility issues for E10 in the United States or in Brazil, in cars, including cars built in the 1960s or even earlier, that it's highly likely that virtually all vehicles in the world today are compatible with E10. Vehicles made to international standards, which really includes all vehicles made in the world, and meeting the Tier 1 or equivalent emission requirements, are highly likely to be able to operate on E15 as well. For E20, there's a significant body of data indicating that certainly what we would call Tier 2 level emissions control cars in the United States, and perhaps older cars, are compatible with E20, but this data set is much smaller than the data that's available on E15. And so we can't draw a conclusion about E20 with the same level of certainty. So looking at emissions levels, each of the study countries has their own emission regulations. Canada and Mexico use the US tiered regulations, and then other countries have their own emission system. In particular, India has its own emission regulations. That's all shown in the chart on the left. The chart on the right translates these into an approximate, it's not identical, but approximate equivalence to the US emission regulations. And you can see that in the early 2000s in India, these are what we would call Tier 0 cars. But then we transition to Tier 1 cars and Tier 2 cars. So when we look at what we learned from our database, the total number of cars, of automobiles in the various study countries, you see that, of course, the US has over 280 million cars. In China, there's over 220 million. India, there's 41 million cars approximately. But when we look on what fuels they use, we see that in India, there's a lot of gray in this lower chart, indicating diesel-powered cars to which ethanol is not applicable. When we remove those from the car fleet, we see about 25 million automobiles in India. Looking at the table on the right, the median age of cars in India is 6 years, which is the second youngest car fleet of the study countries, with only 11% of the cars older than 2005. Only the fleet in China is newer. I think it would not be a good use of our time for me to go through the results for every one of these countries, but I will show you results for India, of course. But first, I'll talk about China just as an example of another country that has the newest vehicle fleet. You can see here in this chart on the left that the vast majority of the cars really are 2010 and later, and a very large fraction of the cars are meeting the equivalent to the Tier 1 standard in the US. One thing about our database, that commercial database, the Experian Vehicle and Operation database, is it lumps all pre-2005 cars together, so we don't necessarily know what model year these pre-2005 cars, but they're a fairly small fraction of the cars in China. So in China, they're the fourth largest ethanol producing nation. They have national standards in place for fuel ethanol and for E10. E10 blends are currently being used. The entire car fleet is very likely compatible with E10 for the reasons we've noted. And 2007 and newer cars, which are the vast majority of the cars, are very likely compatible with E15. Looking at the situation in India, we have 25 million cars. Maybe 12 or 13% of them are pre-2005. The vast majority of the cars are manufactured in India. Many recent owner's manuals for popular models indicate E10 compatibility. India does produce a significant amount of ethanol, making up about 6.4% of the gasoline on the market in 2019. There are standards in place for blends up to E20, and the fuel survey shows that ethanol is being used. So given the US experience and the Brazilian experience and the fact that Indian cars are already using E10, it's likely that all vehicles are compatible with E10. And those sold since 2007, which is about 84% of the fleet, are very likely compatible with E15. One thing that's very important in India is that there's a lot more motorcycles and three-wheelers than there are cars. The chart here, the upper chart, the blue part of the bar shows the motorcycle and three-wheeler registration since 2012. Unfortunately, our database on motorcycles only goes back to 2012, and clearly there's a real dominance of motorcycles on the market. There's 160 million that were registered since 2012. The total population is estimated at over 187 million. These, for the most part, are made by 4 major manufacturers, and they have met an emission standard that's very similar to Euro 1 in 2000 and Euro 2 beginning in 2005. Motorcycles meeting these or equivalent standards are almost clearly compatible with E10. Owner's manuals for the most recent model year indicate compatibility for the Honda models. And so we think there's a very high probability that these 2 and 3 wheelers will work just fine on E10 and potentially on E15 as well. And so summarizing the study for all the countries, as I noted, we think that the differences between conventional gasoline and E10 are so small that vehicles all over the world are compatible with E10. When we look at E15, we don't have quite as much confidence that all vehicles would be compatible, but a very high percentage of vehicles globally are. And in India, that makes up about 84% of the vehicles in use. And just summarizing our conclusions here, given the US and Brazilian experience with introduction of E10, where there were no evidence of compatibility issues even for vehicles dating back to the 1960s, we conclude that virtually all vehicles globally are compatible with E10. Given the extensive database developed by the United States Department of Energy around the 2010 timeframe, vehicles made to international standards and meeting the Tier 1 or equivalent emission requirements are very likely compatible with E15. And while there's less data on E20, and we're hesitant to draw the same level of confidence conclusion that we draw for E15, there is significant data suggesting that many vehicles will operate just fine on E20. This data, or this study, has now been published online. It's available for free at this link here. There's a lot more information backing up our conclusions in the report. I'd encourage you to download it and have a look. I'll come back to the slide so you can write down the link. But with that, I'd just like to thank the U.S. Grains Council for sponsoring this work and for the opportunity to present it to you today. Here's my email address if I can answer any additional questions about the work. And so thank you all for being here this evening, this afternoon, this morning, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was really interesting. I guess, before we get going on questions, I'd like to maybe take a little bit of time to just get first impressions and give Mr. Banerjee the floor for any comments or any questions or any burning question that you may have after hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Bob, for an excellent lucid presentation on the subject of compatibility with E10, E20 in different countries. So thank you very much for this very informative slides. As you, I think, focus on different countries, I believe your primary concluding statements are related to four-wheelers. I hope you're not making statement on the two-wheelers compatibility beyond the statements of facts which is quoted in the operating manuals of some of the company. Am I right?
I think you're correct that our conclusions primarily apply to four-wheelers, but I do think we can conclude quite strongly that the two-wheelers will be compatible with 10% ethanol blends. Our confidence about E15 and E20 is certainly lower for the two-wheelers.
Yeah, because my just a kind of information sharing statement with regards to majority of two-wheelers are 100cc two-wheelers. So because the size of the engine is very small, we have observed, we have done extensive study not only with regards to the emission performance, evaporate emissions, but also the drivability. And we recognize that material compatibility issue is behind us as far as the E10 is concerned, because post 2008, SIAM is declaring that the vehicles are E10 material compatible. But for E20 material compatibility, we have done some study, and currently the study is on with together with the ARAI, IOCL on existing vehicle compatibility issues. As far as the new vehicle goes, we are taking note of the timelines given by Government of India, and necessary rubber material, hose material, sealant material changes are happening in vehicles. So I believe that up to 10% we have good evidence. Above 10%, that is E15 and E20, right now we are not able to make statement whether the vehicle, from our standpoint of view of whether the drivability is good or not, which can be accepted by a normal customer. That study is being carried out at this point in time. So it's a WIP for us. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that important information. That seems like a very important study for the Indian market.
Yeah. Thank you both. Let me get started with some of the questions from the audience. What is your experience of blending of ethanol fuel in diesel across all countries? Is this technology feasible, and what are its challenges?
There has been extensive work on blending ethanol with diesel fuel, and the first issue that arises is that ethanol is not very soluble in diesel fuel, so you have to create an emulsion essentially of the ethanol in the diesel fuel. But there's that creates a major fuel property issue in that the flash point of the fuel, which is a critical property of diesel fuels for safety, is about 20 degrees for an ethanol diesel emulsion. And the flash point is the temperature where the fuel air mixture that's above the fuel in the fuel tank is ignitable. And normally the flash point of a diesel fuel would be either in India, I guess, where wintertime, North American wintertime temperatures are not necessarily a problem. The flash point would be over 52°C in order to make sure that you had a fuel air mixture above the fuel in the vehicle tank that was not ignitable. When the flash point is 20°C and that fuel air mixture above the fuel is ignitable, it's a major safety issue where the fuel tank could, with a spark or in the event of a crash, cause an explosion. So ethanol blended into diesel fuel creates a pretty extreme safety problem, which maybe there's some engineering solutions to dealing with it, but mostly in the United States, at least at the Department of Energy, we've abandoned work on putting ethanol into diesel fuel.
Thank you, Bob. Second question, India has recently launched a scrapping policy suggesting that 20-year-old vehicles need to be scrapped. Your report suggests that even old vehicles made using under international norms are compatible with E10, and all vehicles post 2007 are compatible with E15. So in that situation, what are some of the options, or what should India's scrapping policy look at or consider?
Well, I'm I'm hesitant to make a policy recommendation to the government of India because policies generally need to be based on a significant amount of analysis. But in the U.S., the vehicle scrapping policies that I've seen have generally been focused on upgrading the average level of emission control technology on the vehicles in the fleet. So by removing the oldest vehicles that are going to be the most highly polluting vehicles, regardless of the fuel they're operating on, you raise the level of emission controls on the average vehicle and reduce air pollutant emissions. And I think in most large cities all over the world, that is an important objective.
Mr. Banerjee, any comments?
No, I think Amit is residing in NCR region, and in Delhi, the 10-year-old diesel vehicles are also, not allowed to be run further. So maybe ethanol could be a replacement fuel for such vehicle is the question is aiming at. But to best of my understanding, India is going for scrappage scheme, but it's a voluntary, first of all. It's not a mandatory voluntary scrappage scheme. And secondly, Government of India is very clear when it comes to personal vehicles, then 20 years. And for commercial vehicle, it's a 15 years. So we believe that ethanol discussion in the light of scrappage policy is not directly relevant until you come up with some incentive scheme that if you scrap your vehicle and replace it with E20 or flex fuel vehicle, then some extra incentive is made available to you. So to that extent, it is relevant. Otherwise, no.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. Let me follow up with the next question. Regarding compatibility of vehicle for ethanol percentages higher than 20%, is E100 compatible with fuel tank filling system? Is tin zinc coated steel compatible with ethanol?
We haven't undertaken an analysis of fuel storage tanks at retail sites, for example, fuel retail sites in India, but in the United States, while underground storage tanks are likely compatible with very high ethanol blends, the fuel dispenser itself is not. We're currently in the United States transitioning to a new certification for fuel dispensers that would be compatible with blends up to about E25. But I'm sorry we didn't look at that issue for India. The second question about zinc coated metal, I think in general it's a good idea to avoid zinc coated metal in fuel systems. But I can't point to a specific study that off the top of my head that would tell me, what ethanol levels would become problematic with a zinc coated metal.
Okay. Thank you. Let me address the next question on sharing details on compatibility on commercial vehicles. I believe your presentation will be made available, and the link that you share for the research will also be made available. So I think that question has been addressed. Next question. Is there any possibility in upgrading Tier 1 vehicles to match compatibility with E20?
I suspect that the main issue with a Tier 1 vehicle is going to be, possibly some materials compatibility issues, but also the authority of the car's computer control system to control the air-fuel ratio for that much oxygen in the fuel. So it does seem possible that you could upgrade the car by updating the programming of the computer control system, potentially changing the oxygen sensor in the exhaust. Seems possible to do that. I'm not aware of anyone who's actually done it. In the United States, it would require a complete recertification of that vehicle, of every vehicle model for emissions compliance. But I don't know if the situation is similar in India.
May I add here just what Bob said is very important. Currently, in India, Government of India has instituted a very, very elaborate, comprehensive study to see the effect of E20 blend fuel on the existing fleet. And initially we have found that existing fleet also is of different types. So BS1, BS2, BS3. And it has been found that E20, definitely we have issues with regards to the material compatibility, fuel tank coating, rubber, hoses, sealants, life. So therefore, right now, stated position is that for existing vehicles which are more than 17 crore vehicles on road, that is 170 million vehicles on road, they need to be supported with protection grade E10 fuel till the end of life of their vehicle. Because there are logistic challenges with the oil dispensing companies, Right now, the study is focusing whether these 17 crore vehicles be able to accept E20 fuel with minor upgrades like changing of rubber hose, sealants, or maybe fuel tank coating, or maybe there is some possibility by changing calibration, which Bob is talking about. So this is the very important study currently underway between SIAM member companies. We have given different types of vehicles of different vintage, and IOCL and ARA are doing currently this study. Thank you.
This sounds like an extremely important study that could be valuable to really every country in the world that's considering using ethanol. So I certainly hope those results can be made publicly available at some point in the future.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I think the next question I think you've answered some of the next question's comments, but what do you both see as the options for India, given its fleet characteristics, to achieve broad E20 blending by 2025? And by options, I mean policies such as retrofit requirements or additional studies that would be needed to allow for E20 blends. And Mr. Banerjee, you kind of touched on that just 2 seconds ago. But what are your thoughts, either one of you?
I think it's a very important question and very relevant from the large number of fleets which are originally not designed to fly with E20 fuel. So let me divide my question into the vintage of the vehicle. Today, for example, in India, in 2017, all the two-wheelers were changed to work on fuel injection system with a closed loop concept, with oxygen sensor, managing the exhaust, oxygen content reading, and then fueling is managed. So those vehicles which are carbureted, that is pre-2017 vehicles, we have a limited scope of running those vehicles with E20 without modification. So we'll have to see whether current study which is going on will reveal whether we need to change the carburetor jet settings, whether we need to change some of the sealants, rubber and fuel line components, or we will have to do some other adjustment so that drivability of the pre-2017 vehicle remain acceptable to the customers. Otherwise, it would be very difficult. As of now, what industry position is that those vehicles are not compatible with E20. Therefore, till the end of life of those vehicles, government must supply E10 fuel parallelly. With regards to the vehicles which are post 2017 having a fuel injection system with electronic fuel management and ECU based, oxygen sensor based closed loop systems, there the chances of acceptability of E20 is much higher. And as I mentioned, that those vehicles are also designed with better material, so perhaps the material related challenges could be limited. But all these findings will come out with the study which is currently being done in ARA and IOCL along with SAM members, different vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. And I think you've kind of bled into the next question, which is, wanting to understand challenges and solutions for higher ethanol blends. And I want to kind of pivot that to the U.S. Bob, can you talk to us a bit about how the U.S. kind of, fronted or faced up to the challenges as we are increasing our ethanol blends to higher blends as well? Can you share with us any guidance on the challenges and opportunities for that piece?
Well, we undertook about 10 years ago really major studies of E15 and predominantly E15, but to some extent also E20, involving for example, testing at as many as 70 or 80 cars for their entire what's defined in regulations of their full useful life, which is the time period where they have to meet the emission control regulations, which go out to over 100,000 miles. And I think these very long-term studies provided us with the confidence to move to E15. I think some expanded study of that type and analysis of the results could ultimately lead to the approval of E20. At the same time, we undertook an evaluation of fuel storage tanks and fuel dispensers that dispense the fuel into the cars, and found that some upgrades were needed for E15 and E20. So I think this is an important thing. I'm not sure we expected to find that. And then that part of the industry, as I noted, the fuel dispensing industry is transitioning today. When a gasoline retail site replaces its fuel dispensers today, they're typically replaced with one that's compatible with up to E25. So they've built in some cushion, if you will, in order to be able to expand ethanol blending in the future. Today, we're still predominantly at 10% ethanol in the United States, even though E15 is approved. We do see some increase to E15, especially with the high price of gasoline today. So hopefully that will continue to expand.
Thank you, Bob. And I think to kind of summarize, obviously studying the industry and the challenges, regulation or emissions control regulations, and kind of outlining all the stakeholders in the value chain as well, is what I hear as needing to come together to be able to transition smoothly to a better compatibility between higher ethanol blends and the cars that we're putting out in the road. So, and to Mr. Banerjee, I think that's something that SIAM is already doing. So next question: how to recover the fuel efficiency loss due to lower calorific value of ethanol?
So at E10, this is a very small difference. Really not so much in efficiency, but in fuel economy. The engine efficiency doesn't necessarily change, but the energy content of the fuel is very slightly lower. I think my experience is that a user in the real world, where there's many factors that affect vehicle fuel economy, will have trouble seeing the difference between a 10% ethanol blend and a no ethanol gasoline. Although in theory there is a small reduction in fuel economy. For higher ethanol blends, perhaps there is an issue. Some cars, I don't know how many, but some cars will take advantage of the slightly higher octane number of ethanol blends to operate the engine in a slightly more efficient manner with more advanced spark timing. But it's not clear that all the cars on the US market or in any other market are actually capable of doing that. So I know that's only a partial answer to the question, but hopefully it's helpful.
No, thank you. It's really exciting. I see a lot more questions coming up. And I'm cognizant of the time. We have about 10 more minutes, so let's see if we can get through a lot of these. But if we don't, I do want to make available that we can answer these questions offline as well. So if we don't get to your question, don't be discouraged. We will reach out. So next question: Are are FRP tanks compatible with E20 blends?
What kind of tanks? I didn't quite catch that.
FRP?
And I'm not familiar with that term.
Okay. We'll come back to that. In addition to the previous query, which ethanol blend out of given range is worse with regards to compatibility, performance, and durability?
Well, I think when we consider E10, E15, and E20 blends, in terms of materials compatibility, vehicle calibration, potential impact on fuel economy, the highest blend is going to be the most challenging.
On that question, there's a follow-up question. Have there been any studies conducted? Has it been conducted any durability studies on engines and field trials before introducing compliant vehicles?
In the United States, I think much of our introduction of ethanol has been more trying to understand if vehicles that have already been manufactured would be compatible with increasing levels of ethanol. Certainly, the automobile manufacturers have then, as ethanol or E15 has been introduced, have introduced vehicles that they state are compatible with E15, for example. I don't know if any in the United States. I don't think any of the car manufacturers currently state that their cars are compatible with E20.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any commercial vehicles in production which are running with diesel ethanol blend? Is any technology partner working on this technology to use in future with ethanol blending in diesel fuel? And you kind of touched on the ethanol and diesel piece. So I'm curious to this answer.
Well, there are some companies still working on ethanol diesel blends using various engineering approaches to try to mitigate the safety issue of the flashpoint. These include systems that provide nitrogen blanketing in the fuel tank, that try to ground the fuel tank to eliminate the potential of static charge. Really, putting ethanol in diesel fuel requires a significant level of fuel additive to create the emulsion, fuel additive to improve the lubricity of the fuel so that the vehicle fuel pump will have adequate durability on the ethanol diesel emulsion, and also fuel additives to increase the cetane number, which is a critical diesel fuel property, and which ethanol cetane number is extremely low. So there are companies working on this. I'm not familiar with any ongoing commercial vehicle demonstrations, but there have been some in the past. Certainly, it can be made to work, but there is a significant cost to making it safe and making it work.
Thank you, Bob. And I want to do a quick pivot. There's one question on the U.S. Experience before we pivot to India. But the question is, U.S. is the largest producer of ethanol. Why are you not going to higher ethanol blends of E20 and other than flex fuels?
I think that's a complex question that has both economic and political dimensions. I think there's a substantial body of evidence that consumers would benefit from E15 blends in that gasoline prices would be marginally lower. I think that the companies that manufacture the petroleum derived fuel and distribute it are not currently willing to give up that additional 5% of market share. So while a strong case can be made for going to higher blends, there's people that make the opposite case, and so the government has not mandated it or provided any additional incentives for it. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Bob. I mean, I think it strikes at kind of the heart of all the conversations that we have, because we do know that the U.S. industry does have a mandate in place for E10, and that's been made available across the country. But there's definitely still more work to be done on the higher ethanol blends. And I think I would say that the interest is definitely there, and that technology is also advancing. But thank you for your answer. Pivoting a bit to India, Mr. Banerjee, there's a question on, will the ARAI IOCL study also check if pollution levels will be lowered with an E20 blended fuel?
Yes, it's a very comprehensive study. Test plan have been made. It includes performance of the vehicle, emission, evaporative emission, drivability, durability. So therefore, it's an on-road testing as well, emission cycle testing, fuel efficiency. So it's a very comprehensive, and it will incorporate all the development steps.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. Going back to ethanol and its properties, we have a question on, ethanol has a property of absorbing moisture. What problems can it cause in combustion?
It certainly is true that ethanol, neat ethanol, or fuel grade ethanol can absorb moisture from the environment, and so it needs to be handled in such a way that it remains in specification. So there's generally standards for the quality of the ethanol blend stock have a limit on the allowable water content. For a blended fuel, putting ethanol into the gasoline essentially increases its water tolerance. It increases the amount of water that you can have present before the water forms a separate phase, before the water comes out as a layer on the bottom of the tank. And in general, what I think we see, clearly what we see in the United States, even in parts of the United States that are quite humid for many parts of the year, is that we don't see a major problem with water causing phase separation of the fuel, where you'd have a hydrocarbon layer in the top of the tank and a water plus ethanol layer in the bottom of the tank. From a combustion perspective, the amount of water we're talking about, if it's dissolved in the fuel, is so small that it really doesn't have an impact on combustion.
Okay. Thank you both. We are at the top of the hour, and I like to address. We still have some questions. We will take your questions and reply to them via email. So thank you very much for your participation. As we wrap up, though, and kind of going into some of the trends of the question are, there's clearly a challenge ahead. There's opportunities ahead as well. There's a question around kind of a roadmap, and so within that framework, I think particularly for India, the ethanol roadmap that was sent out in July of this year definitely kind of creates the room or the platform for these types of discussions to happen. We've heard from Mr. Banerjee on this report and study that they're working on that really looks at all of the technical aspects of how do you transition a fleet Hopefully the conversations that we had today regarding the compatibility of vehicles complements that. But as parting words from both of you, how do you see the path forward? Obviously, we know that India has a very robust and a very intense goal by 2025. How can we all support reaching that goal? And your final thoughts on that as we finalize our program tonight.
Thank you,
Well,
Alejandra, for your. Yeah, Bob, you want to go ahead? Go ahead, please.
no, I'm happy for you to go first.
Okay. Uh, Actually, India is trying to experience this new journey of higher blends of ethanol usage in transportation sector. So our challenge is not only making a vehicle compatible vehicle, you know, performing to its level with desired level of fuel efficiency, with emission and drivability, but more importantly, starts from logistic supply chain management to the standards, regulations, policy, as well as what is the price at which the customer will get the fuel. So as Bob rightly said, that it's not a very straight question. It is having a lot of variables in it. So in India, for example, when we talk about flex fuel or we talk about E100, we are actually at this point in time not very clear whether we need to pick up American standards of E93 or E100, or we have to pick up Brazilian spec, which is E93 with 7% water. So right from standard making to making a flex fuel range, whether the range of the flex fuel in India should be limited to 20 to 85% and not keep it open up to E100. These are the questions we are actually currently facing, which the answer may lie in information exchange with experts from US. So US Grain Council's, um, close cooperation, collaboration, and continuous exchange on such platforms like this Ethanol Talk series or this, platform is giving us a lot of information on vehicle performance, its compatibility. So we are looking forward in coming days some kind of structured way of exchange of information, which will benefit both of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. Bob?
Yes, from my perspective, the greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits of ethanol are clear, and there's also potentially some benefits in terms of tailpipe emissions of carbon monoxide and fine particles. And so I'm really excited to see about the program that the government of India has announced to move to higher ethanol level blends. But it's also very important, and I didn't know about it until this call, the very comprehensive studies that are being undertaken by SIAM and the government of India to understand the compatibility of four-wheeler and two-wheeler vehicles in India with higher level ethanol blends. So that's really good to see. I mean, it's really important to do that type of work. So it sounds to me like a very comprehensive program to try to shift the transportation energy economy towards ethanol is being undertaken, and that it's being done right. So that's very gratifying to see.
Absolutely, and we couldn't agree more. We definitely see a potential for having the three largest producers of ethanol share information, share knowledge and expertise as each one of us kind of faces different challenges on this implementation or in this transition into energy transition itself. But more specifically, and something that we're starting to hear a lot of is ethanol is the lowest hanging fruit available in the market right now, for the many benefits that it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, to potential other benefits around tailpipe emissions, etc. But it's practically a technology that we already have. It's a technology that we already know. And we need to be able to leverage that technology to its full capacity, which I think we're still kind of in that process. So very thankful to the both of you for sharing our space today, for sharing your thoughts. Bob, excellent report. Mr. Banerjee, really interesting information and insight into what the Indian auto industry is looking at, and where can we find those pockets of support and collaboration and really learning opportunity. This report that you are commissioning in conjunction with other members, as Bob said, could have definitely global implications in understanding what that transition can look like. And I think at the end of the day, India has always positioned itself as a leader in several industries. So kudos to you and your team for that. With that, I want to thank all of our participants. Sorry we went a little bit over. Thank you for your time and your participation today. Our next ethanol series will be on December 9th. We will be looking at world energy outlook and what to expect from biofuel innovations, discussions with the International Energy Association, the IEA. We will be sending out more information in the next couple of weeks. But once again, thank you so much for participating, and we will see you next time on the third edition of the Ethanol Speaker Series. Have a good night, good day, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.